Hi, I'm David Wells. How many of you know who I am? Well, you got to be careful because that's my very next joke. How many of you are thinking to yourself, he doesn't look like that guy because I'm shorter than he is. I'm actually a little older than he is. But for many years, it was very useful for restaurant reservations when he was in Boston because I live in Providence. I'm the other David Wells, all right? How many of you went and looked at my website? So the rest of you what? You're just walking down the street and, all right. Decide to live dangerously. The class is called Personal Project is a Professional Tool. I want to thank Olympus for sponsoring me today, for B&H for having me. I have a lot to do in the next 2 hours. In the best of all worlds, I will be done in an hour and a half and then give you half an hour of questions, okay? Try to save the questions at the end for two reasons. One, because they're videotaping this, and I look more elegant if I keep my questions at the end. But also, I'm hoping to answer most of your questions as I go through the talk, all right? And I'm going to take you through a project called Foreclosed Dreams, which is what I'm working on right now. And I will talk a lot about personal projects, and I'm going to talk about this one mostly because A, it's the most current, B, it does this thing that we want to talk about, which is how do you use personal projects for professional advancement, and C, it's completely digital from beginning to end. And so I have every single email that I've ever sent in relation to this project. And when we get onto the promotion and marketing part, that actually becomes a pretty big part of what I want to talk about. But we are going to go back to the very beginning. So which one am I? The Butterball is my younger brother. He really doesn't like this photograph. I was born in Albany, got to California when I was 3, essentially grew up in Southern California. Smog, cars, freeways. I had a really, really good photography teacher in high school who taught me everything he knew, and then he turned me loose. And I used to get on the buses in Southern California and take little adventures. And then I went to a private college in Southern California, right? Hey, would it make you happier if I stood right here? And, yeah, I used to have a chin and I used to have a lot of hair. And somebody was asking before, no, I did not actually live out of a Volkswagen bus, though I had many peers who did. At Pitzer College, what was important for me, I'd already learned sort of the craft of photography. I started studying the history of photography, and I'm going to talk a lot about the history of photography because it's very important to the whole sort of lesson of what I want to get across today. And as I was studying the history of photography, every week I would get introduced to a new photographer. And not surprisingly, I'd go out and make pictures, and I was imitating them. This week I was Dwayne Michaels, who does portraits and self-portraits and sequences. This week I was imitating Robert Frank. This week I actually was Bill Brandt, and I actually am in the UK, so I'm doing it more authentically. This week I was Irving Penn, and I'm being only half sarcastic. More Irving Penn. And my photographs are a continual struggle between the formal, which are these two nice colors, and the informational. And I think all photographs are essentially that balancing act. If you have too much information, you're sort of photocopying the reality that's out there. If it's too formal, you don't get the viewer's attention because there's nothing beyond just the form. And we're not going to talk about the person who actually drove their Jaguar under a school bus in New York City in 1978. So I finished college. I knew nothing really about photography, and so I started chasing politicians in Southern California. You may recognize this guy, the guy standing on top with Olympus cameras, no less, way back when. This guy's the guy who won that year, though. And I ended up photographing him a lot because he was in Southern California. This is the first photograph of a president-elect of the United States wearing blue jeans, which is why it's so big on the fashion page of the New York Times Magazine back in 1980. It's also the classical example. I actually have a rotor growing out of the head of the President of the United States from a helicopter. So again, I was pretty successful at marketing myself, but I knew nothing about photography really. As a photojournalist, so I took a step back and I worked for a series of small, medium, and large newspapers in Southern California initially, doing weather features. This is a hot day in Los Angeles, watching people do stupid things like drive pickup trucks into swimming pools. Photographed the May Day riot. This guy keeps coming back. Does anybody know who this is, by the way? Are we getting to the point in history where there's a set of people who don't quite know who that is? At the same time, I met a woman who was going to graduate school here in New York City. So my next project, besides moving up the food chain in photojournalism, is to get to New York City. And I got halfway across to Texas. You can see how happy I am to be in Texas. But in Texas, I did my first in-depth photo story. And so now we're actually going to start getting to what we're here to talk about, which is a personal project. And this is the first photo story I did for a newspaper called the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. It's a story on a homeless family living in a school bus outside Fort Worth, Texas. And I'm going to go through relatively quickly. This is just to give you some background in terms of what I've done. Hiding out in the wheel well of a bus in a rainstorm. And so I'm still in pursuit of this woman, and now I've gotten to the same time zone. I'm now in Syracuse, New York, and I've discovered a couple things. One is that I have no future as a newspaper photographer. And two, I love doing photo stories, and that's what I want to do. So my next big photo story was for the Syracuse newspapers, following 4 young men into the United States Marine Corps together. There's a guy named Matt Ware. He's saying goodbye to his girlfriend. He and his best friend are going to the Marines together. The guy on your left is named Greg Fisher. He's never been on a plane before. Plane takes off, stomach drops out. Imagine, and I'm sitting in the row in front of him, turned around backwards, doing flash fill on an airplane. Can you say air marshal? So they get their head shaved. They go through basic training. And they come back, and now actually they're married, and he's a policeman in upstate New York. One of the things to start thinking about on this personal project question, how many people here are in the middle of a personal project? How many people are thinking of doing a personal project? All right. How many of you would roughly define your personal project as documentary derived? How many people would define your project as more or less personal or fine art? Okay. I'm going to talk about both. What you've just seen, those two are obviously more on the documentary-derived side. This last one it's called narrative. It's very linear because I'm following a set of people as they have character evolution, just like you have in a film or a movie or anything like that. Your project doesn't have to be that way, but it does have to have a structure. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And so this stuff was used in Syracuse and a bunch of other places. And then the woman in question, we got married, moved to Philadelphia where she had a job, and I started doing photo stories for the Philadelphia Inquirer Sunday magazine. There's a story on teenagers living in abandoned buildings, squatters. And then in 1988, I got a grant from another big camera company, but not Olympus, because Olympus didn't give out grants at the time. They're going to start, though, here soon, right, guys? Sorry. I got a grant from Nikon, because at the time I was using Nikon cameras, and I did a story on the pesticide poisoning of farm workers in California. And this is a very small selection from the project. Stories about agricultural chemicals and how they affect farm workers, and especially farm worker children. And the use of pesticides results in elevated incidences of childhood cancer and birth defects. And so there's a girl named Laura Gonzalez receiving chemotherapy. This is her mother. And this little boy's the worst example of what I saw. It's technically called limb reduction defect, which is the result of first trimester exposure of pregnant women to pesticides. He's developmentally perfectly normal. He's got to be near 40 now. And my attempt at a crucifix metaphor for the farm worker population. And I got very, very lucky with this work, not just because I got a grant from Nikon, which is an enormously important thing because it enabled me to do it, but it also got published a lot. And depending on time and questions at the end, I want to go back to that idea of how much you put your work out there, what the opportunities are. Because when I put this work out there, it was the beginning of what we now know as the organic food movement. Everybody goes to Whole Foods now, right? That's not something that's been going on for 100 years. It's a relatively recent thing. The connection being that this work came out and was widely published in what I call the milieu. Does everybody know what the word milieu means? It's a French word. It kind of means market, but it's a bigger word than an economic market. And so when you talk about pesticides and food, for example, you can think of the organic food movement and how we think about food and food safety as a big political question out there. And I got very lucky fitting my work into that larger milieu. That's like rule number one for those of you who want to go forward with doing personal projects. You are going to do much better if you can figure out a way to take what you're doing and somehow, just a little, kind of massage it to fit into what's going on out there. And it's a timing thing, because I've done a number of projects where I mistimed them, where I was too early or too late, and I wasn't able to fit it in with the milieu. This is one that was very successful, though. This was the Philadelphia Inquirer Sunday magazine. This is a magazine called California Magazine. And then we're jumping forward a little bit. Through the 80s, I started working more and more in the Middle East. That's my Israeli press card. In 1991, I moved to Israel to do a project which morphed from what I proposed to do to what I ended up doing quite a bit. But it ended up being on the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. And one of the things about your personal projects you should be asking, and I probably sound like I'm being simplistic here, but the question is, what can you say that somebody else hasn't said? That's question number one with a personal project. If you do a personal project like everybody else has done, why is somebody going to publish you, exhibit you, anoint you, or whatever you want to call those things, okay? And if you do something that's too far afield, that they don't know what you're doing, they don't get it, it doesn't fit within that milieu I was talking about, you're just as much trouble. So I spent about 6 months on this project trying to figure out what could I say about Israelis and Palestinians that hadn't been said. And of course, we know the conflict. Windows on a bus that had been damaged by Palestinians throwing stones, Israelis on the same bus. Israeli soldiers watching Palestinians come out of Friday prayers. And so I photographed the conflict a lot. But over time, I started to understand that what was actually more important than photographing the conflict was photographing the full range of interaction, conflict, coexistence, and cooperation. And so this is the tomb of Abraham. You may know that Muslims and Jews trace their lineage to the same patriarch. And at this point in time, they actually used to share this shrine. And so this is shift change. The Jews are starting to pray and the Muslims are finishing, sort of sharing a street, shooting the breeze, a mixed livestock market. And then these are intentional efforts at cooperation. A school program bringing Israeli and Palestinian school kids together, shopping side by side, and then a mixed rally for peace. And I started this work in 1990. The first Gulf War came along, and I was living in Israel doing this project. I've never figured out how a nice way to say it, but I made a lot of money off the first Gulf War because all the other photographers went to Kuwait, and I stayed in Israel, and I ended up working for Life magazine and the New York Times. And so that funded what you just saw. And then I applied for a grant from the MacArthur Foundation. You've heard of the MacArthur Foundation? They have their Genius Grants. Didn't get a Genius Grant. I got a grant from their program called Research and Writing on International Peace and Cooperation. So the second big lesson that I learned, the first lesson is this idea of the milieu. The second lesson I learned from the MacArthur thing is that they saw what I was doing, photographing not just a conflict and not just the intentional cooperation, but that middle ground of coexistence, of ordinary interaction between the two, as research and writing on international peace and cooperation. And bless their hearts, because they gave me the money in 92, and then 93, 94, the Oslo Peace Accords came along, and because there was this larger milieu of things going on and of interest, suddenly the work was very, very topical. And so it got published lots and lots of places. Be aware that your work the project you're aspiring to doesn't have to be documentary, okay? But this idea of fitting it in so other people on the outside are interested is enormously important. So what I discovered is it's less about photography and it's more about the subject matter. And so I'm something now known as something of an expert in the Middle East. And here's my Palestinian press card showing you both sides. My first wife and I had a child. My first wife and I got divorced. My daughter's now 20. This is my second wife, who's from India. I mention that because it's going to explain the upcoming work that's from India. For the last 15 years, I've been photographing the impact of globalization in South Asia, mostly in your tax dollars. I've been there on 2 Fulbright fellowships. The reason I got Fulbright fellowships was not because I was a photographer. I got Fulbright fellowships because I understood that milieu of interest in South Asia, and I got Fulbright fellowships because I was developing an expertise in South Asia. And I had gotten through the MacArthur Fellowship that I talked about before without doing anything stupid. How many of you know what the Chronicle of Philanthropy is? It's the weekly newspaper for the foundation world, okay? Your goal when you're on a grant is to avoid ending up in the Chronicle of Philanthropy as some story where David Wells got a grant from the MacArthur Foundation, then went off to Mexico and snorted all the money up his nose. And I'm only being half sarcastic. But I got through the MacArthur okay. I subsequently had 2 Fulbright fellowships, which enabled me to do this project. People ask me if I set up my photographs. Am I smart enough to hire 2 guys to drive a computer monitor around Bangalore in southern India? No. I'm smart enough to hire a guy to build a sidewalk under such a good billboard. So obviously this is all found stuff. And again, try really hard not to say, oh, he does documentary, I don't want to do documentary. Because in a minute I'm going to start talking about the personal project in general, but this whole thing is to give you a sense of why am I up here? Why should you be listening? The other thing that I do, and this is going to feed into, how many people actually looked at my website and saw the Foreclosed Dreams work by any chance? Okay. Then you'll. The other thing that I do besides the political stories that you just saw is I love to photograph spaces. And one of my favorite spaces is 30th Street Station in Philadelphia, which is this really beautiful train station. You have that funny thing over on 30th and 7th Avenue, Penn Station. That exactly. Every time I go through there, I go, right. This is a beautiful station. It's a beautiful old building. In the 70s and 80s, when people were tearing stuff down in New York, apparently Philadelphia was so poor they couldn't afford to tear it down. And so these stories, which I sometimes do simultaneously to the more political stories, are not political. They're just about a place, the play of light and shadow. I'm on the 5th floor catwalks looking straight down. And these are palm prints and fingerprints and oil from people's hands on a glass door backlit at the end of the day. And so this was published by the Philadelphia Inquirer Sunday magazine and a number of other places as well. Another story that I did for the same magazine, also about a place, not about it as a political place, though there are plenty of political stories there, was on the Western Wall in Jerusalem, which went on and won an award from Communication Arts. How many of you read Communication Arts? How many of you are going to go home and find out what Communication Arts is? All right. Communication Arts is published out of Palo Alto, California. And every year they have a photography annual. And way back in 1991, this project won an award from Communication Arts. And the reason you should be looking at Communication Arts is that they've done a very good job of staying up with what's topical in the whole world, including fine art and personal photography these days. And they give out these awards. And if you're in CA, which is how people describe in the trade, you're fat and happy for 5 years. And so from 91 to 96, I was doing really well. Every year I apply because I'm looking forward to being fat and happy again. And so this is some other samples of what I do with the expertise I just showed you, the sort of politically human documentary and the play of light and shadow. This is a story for a magazine called Aramco World on pearl processing. A very recent job that I did in India for the same magazine. And so these are more recent photos, still about the play of light and shadow in different parts, in this case of South Asia. We're in Bangladesh here, Sri Lanka. Also in Sri Lanka, and there's the toy store. Everybody gets a little mystified by that one. Back in Bangladesh. In India, an altar boy at an Indian Christian church. And yes, the burglar bars are in fact shaped like crosses. This is the opener on my website for those of you who went. A food market at night. And for me, this is work from the last project that I did before the one I'm going to talk about in a little bit. For me, India is both an intellectual experience, the politics of globalization, changing gender roles, but it's also this aesthetic experience about the light and the atmosphere that I was just showing you. So the project I did before this, I actually took the more poetic images and the more political informational images, the informational and the aesthetic images, and made diptychs and triptychs that are about this size, and then made an exhibition that traveled around there, because I wanted the viewer to have that experience of both the intellectual and the aesthetic. Some more from the same project. And so that brings us to the current project, Foreclosed Dreams. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you the actual project. I'm going to walk you through the process of photographing it. I'm going to stop and take a detour, because those of you who are more interested in the fine art are by then going to feel completely unloved. And I'll try to say something to bring you back into the fold. And then I'm going to go through the sort of minutia of the project, because the second 45 minutes or hour are, I think, what you really want to know. This is mostly to set the scene, kind of convince you to pay attention, and so we'll go from there. So the project is on foreclosed houses. I started this in 2009. And I initially was photographing with the guys who clean up the houses. Because what's it like to go through somebody's train wreck and sort the stuff out? And unfortunately, though it's very compelling this way, most of what they did that was interesting in terms of a narrative was things they would say. They would describe, oh my God, I've seen this, oh my God, I've seen that. But it basically looked like a bunch of guys cleaning out a bunch of old houses. So I changed my project. And I mention that because the idea of what you're going to propose and what you aspire to do and then what you go find in the field has to be different. If you are so good that you can dream up a project in your head and then go out and execute it exactly the same, you're not really stretching your imagination, okay? And most of your funders and the publishers and the exhibitors understand that what you aspire to and what you're actually going to do are different. And every single project of mine has always had that same sort of arc of what I aspired to do and what I actually succeeded in doing. So I was photographing this guy named Thomas Hallstein, and as I said, initially I was photographing the guys, but what I found the most interesting was the stuff that was left behind. And so it morphed from being about the guys doing the cleanup to what I think of as the ghosts of the people who had been in these houses. And this is literally the same house. That's why these two photos are there. So I'm going to take you through a bunch of photos. Some I'll talk about the geography, some I'll talk about the story behind. I've now photographed in 15 states. I aspire to photograph in 30 states because then I can say it's a nationwide project. I initially started in California. Then I did a lot in Rhode Island. And like I said, now I'm up to 15 states. Why did I start in California? My sister lives in the Central Valley of California, and she was very helpful in terms of access getting to the pesticide families because she works in the medical field out in California. And she knows, it turns out, a lot of people in real estate in California. I mention that because one of the things that's going to start happening with your project, if you do it a while, is you're going to say, okay, so how do I expand it? Where do I find more people? Where do I go with it? And you really need to be thinking about your outward network. And I'll talk more about that, give examples of that in a little while. California. I started in Merced and Stockton, which at the time was sort of the epicenter of the foreclosure crisis. They'd built all these houses for the people who were going to do that horrible 2.5, 3-hour drive from the Central Valley over to Silicon Valley and back every night. And not surprisingly, it was not sustainable. And I'm not smart enough to put stick pins in a smiley face pattern. This was in Stockton, California. The young boy who had all these trophies was some kind of karate champion, and he couldn't, when they got foreclosed and had to move, they couldn't take the trophies, so they stripped all the plaques off, but they actually left all the trophies behind. Los Angeles. I work in 3 situations. I either work with the realtors, the cleanup contractors, Or increasingly, because I'm getting sort of known and I go back to the same people a lot, they increasingly give me the addresses and the lockbox codes, and they send me out on my own, and then I call them up afterwards and report in on their houses. So they're basically getting a free house inspection on my time. But this is one of those where there's a cleanup contractor in the other room, and so I'm under a lot of pressure, which is what I learned when I was back in the newspaper days, to work fast, because I know in about 10 minutes these guys are going to come out with a broom and sweep up this room, and my pacifier is going to be gone. San Francisco. This is in Michigan. In Providence, Rhode Island, where I live. This house was so clean you could have eaten lunch off the floor. Not all the foreclosures that I've seen by any stretch are disasters, nor are they all only the low end of the socioeconomic. Somebody asked me if I set that up. I know it's a cliche, and I said it 5 times, but I'm just not smart enough to think, let's go out and buy a Lemony Snicket book, soak it in the water, and then drop it on the floor. No. And I'm doing this is also back in California, I'm doing pretty much all of these shoots at the beginning and the end of other jobs or assignments or classes that I do. So whenever I find, oh, I'm going to be teaching a class, like I was in Arizona and Nevada about 3 weeks ago. So after lining up a class there, then I start calling around and trying to find houses. I mention that because it's not like I get to fly off wherever I want to photograph whatever I want. I'm trying to do this in between other things. Buffalo, New York. This is back in California. This was a model house, one of those houses that's like built beautifully, and then the contractor realizes he's going bankrupt, so he takes a chainsaw and cuts all the fixtures out. It was beautifully cut. I mean, everything is just rectilinear. This is light painting. A lot of the houses I go into are absolutely pitch black and they're boarded up. So my camera's actually on a tripod and I'm actually using a flashlight and light painting. And I know it doesn't look like the light painting you're used to, but a lot of times it's a problem you're up against, which is you're going into a house that's been boarded up, and so you end up doing light painting. Pittsburgh. Also in Pittsburgh, same house. And so this is another one of these time lapses. I'm driving from southern Florida to Tallahassee, the northern part of Florida. And I do a lot of driving for this project. And as I was saying before, the 3 people I work with, the agents, the contractors who clean them out. And so the sort of point being here is that I'm always looking further and further out my network. In a little while, I'm going to ask you all if anybody here can help me out with the project. This is back in Rhode Island, and this is the sort of stereotypical foreclosure. Los Angeles. This is the same house. Somebody asked me the other day, it was a great question. She said the work looked like the work from Chernobyl when the people had to flee because of, I said, it's a great point. I don't think it was Chernobyl. I actually think it was the biblical Exodus, especially this one, because if you know the story of Exodus, they have to flee before they can even bake the bread. And so this is in Southern California, and this was literally the day after the family had been evicted. Same house. Same house. And as you might imagine, this has made me very, very cautious about paying my mortgage on time. We're back in Rhode Island here. Also in California. Everybody interprets this one differently. It's you have a tennis ball on a rope, you pull your car in, your car hits the tennis ball, that's when you stop. These people put a rabbit there. That rabbit right there. And it's a question, do you photograph it so you can see the rabbit, or do you want to be a little more allegorical? Now we're in Florida. And this is me at work in Florida. 95% of what I do with a tabletop tripod, and I'll show you my tabletop tripod in a little while. One of the things, especially when I'm working on my own, is that I'm going into these houses of my own, and some of them are in less desirable neighborhoods than others. So I'm not generally going in there with my $600 Gitso and all the hardware. In fact, what I usually go in with is that. This is my camera bag of choice, all right? Because I don't want to look like I know what I'm doing. So this is also in Florida, actually. And I made that. Also in Florida. One of the highest end houses I've seen. When I was a kid, I didn't get to have a chalkboard in my closet. That was not how I grew up. In Louisiana. This couple, actually, he was an FBI agent and she was in the New Orleans City Police. And the reason I know that is because the agent, because I talk to a lot of these agents at great length for a lot of reasons. It's cathartic for them. They have to go through these things. And this woman, Liz, was telling me, you know, you don't understand. These people, they're not all poor people. It's not all poor people who got caught up in this thing. It's two professionals in this case got caught up. Back in Rhode Island. And you've heard the story, but this is one of the better ones, unfortunately, that I photographed of people who actually put their hands through the walls in rage at the bank. In the Bronx. Also in the Bronx. That's the kind of phone I grew up with. And this is in Massachusetts. And I am using a real-life tripod here, just to confuse you all. And some of the houses certainly are very creepy. This one, this agent called me up and said, you really got to come see this house because they'd apparently been drawing on it for years. Because this was made in, I think, 2010, but it goes back to Super Bowl, whatever, 2007. And so what I'm most interested in is photographing the ghosts of the people who used to be there. And I'm telling you that partly because of my work, but I'm also telling you, how many of you know what an elevator pitch is? You're in an elevator, you're on the 30th floor of the Empire State Building, you're going to the ground floor, and for reasons unknown, the curator at ICP is actually next to you, and you know that's him or her, depending on which curator it is. You've got 30 seconds to sell yourself. I'm David Wells, I've been photographing inside foreclosed houses for the last 4 years. I go in after the houses are, after they've been foreclosed and before they've been cleaned up so I can photograph the ghosts of the people who used to be in there. Then he or she hands me their card and they want to see the work. Do you see what I'm saying? So you need to actually be thinking, how are you going to explain your project? Whether it's documentary or not doesn't matter, but that idea of the elevator pitch is enormously important. So this is a shoot in Massachusetts, and this is actually what was on the wall. Hello, new owners, please take care. I can't make this stuff up. Woonsocket, Rhode Island. Your credit score is very bad. New Jersey. South Carolina. North Carolina. Seen obviously a lot of vandalism where people rip fixtures out, stuff like this. This is in North Carolina also. And there's a very specific reason I chose not to photograph people going through foreclosure. Number one is because a number of other photographers who are more adept at that kind of work have done that exact same kind of thing. There's a woman named Renee Beyer out in Sacramento who's done a couple really great projects actually photographing families going through the foreclosure. My concern about that kind of work is when we see one family, we tend to feel really bad for them, but we don't think about the larger political issue. I'm trying really hard in this work to get you to think, oh, that could possibly have been me or my family or somebody on a bad day. And I want you to kind of put yourself in there in a different way than if I show you a specific family. That idea becomes very important both in terms of my project and almost any project. I mean, when we tell stories, which is what we do as photographers, don't you want the viewer to listen, look, and somehow connect to it? And the most typical way to connect to it, of course, is feel like that might be me. I could have a part of that experience or stuff. So that idea of empathy, or another word I've often heard is called intersubjectivity. Both of them talk about the idea of connecting your viewer to what it is you want them to experience through the photographs and not necessarily personalizing it. We were in North Carolina and found a birth certificate from Virginia. Again, one of the more high-end houses I saw. And this is brand new work. This is just from Arizona a couple weeks ago. Do we have any Southerners in the room? All right. What do you Southerners have for wallpaper? I've noticed very distinct geographic trends. Up in New England and Massachusetts, not surprisingly, a lot of the houses are older. There's no great surprise. Out in the far west, they tend to be newer. Southwest Arizona, Nevada, you tend to get the sort of pseudo-adobe Southwest thing. But in the deep South, you guys just love wallpaper. It's an amazing thing. In Phoenix. And I've seen this, and we all have these. This is something that's very important in terms of my process, and it probably should become part of all your process. As I've seen probably half a dozen of these markers, but this was the best one. A lot of them, the wood and the pencil ran together, the background was no good. So I photographed probably half a dozen of these height markers, but this one, I mean, you all got it. You can hear. When I'm showing my work, I literally try to listen, because when you hear people take their breath and they go like that, they get it. So this is the best one of the height markers, and this is brand new. This is just from Arizona a couple weeks ago. In Nevada. In Florida. Also in Nevada, actually. That didn't work out too well, did it? And this is for the second, this is from 2010. People ask me if I set up pictures. I'm in a house in Connecticut, in eastern Connecticut, and I come around the corner in the bathroom and somebody's actually stuffed an American flag into the towel rack. So then it's only a question of making sure the people who are cleaning don't get there too soon, and how can I organize the photograph the way I want. But it's a found photo. So part of the reason I'm up here is hopefully to get you to understand this idea of the personal project, but part of it is purely mercenary. So I'm going to ask you all a question now. Can anybody help me access foreclosures to photograph anywhere in the US? If you think you can, come up afterwards. You get a prize. You either get a fine art print for your wall, or if you want to come along on the shoot, you're welcome to. I'm quite serious, by the way. About a third of the houses that I've accessed in the last couple of years have come through this kind of thing. And it's really simple in a way. If one of you calls up a friend of yours and says, hey, John, you should talk to this guy, he's not crazy. Or if I call him cold, okay? So it's about getting people to understand what I'm trying to do. Typically people who are photographers have some connection to the arts, their partners are photographers. People who are more understanding can understand what I'm trying to do. I mention it because it would be helpful. We'll talk at the end. But I also mention it because in terms of your personal projects, you need to start thinking about this kind of thing. Where are you going to find people to photograph? How are you going to get your work out there? All of this stuff is out there if you understand and how you are continually asking people. All right? So remember I said my stuff is documentary. Don't get too obsessed about that. How many know who John Sarkowski is? Good. He isn't completely out of our memory yet. He was curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art from 70-something to 91, I recently read, for over 20 years. He wrote a bunch of really, really important books. My favorite book was called Mirrors and Windows. The idea was that photographs were either mirrors of the author or windows to somewhere else. And I'm mentioning that because up till now, what I've been showing you is largely windows. I'm going to briefly highlight some mirrors so those of you on the fine art side don't feel as if you're not getting your attention. Another way of thinking about it is documentary versus fine art. Another way of thinking about it is private versus public, okay? Everything I've been doing is largely so far public, documentary, window. The work I'm going to show you here in a minute is all the opposite. Okay, this is my wife's work, so I'm a little bit prejudiced. The reason I'm showing it to you is because some of the questions I'm going to have, like how do you market your work? What's the idea of the milieu? Who's going to pay you to do it? The grants, etc. I can actually answer the exact same questions for a fine art photographer as for a documentary photographer, because we help each other go through many of the same steps. So the first, I'm going to show you 4 very small sets of her work just to get you to understand it. The work is called Bollywood Satirized. She's from India. It takes existing Indian film posters, and then she redoes the type and makes social commentary. This is on arranged marriages. The characters are, in fact, from Indian film posters. Obviously, the title and the text is not. When she was a young girl, her auntie would tell her, don't play in the sun, you'll get dark and no one will marry you. And there's actually a skin cream in India called Fair and Lovely to lighten women's skin. This is about premarital sex, the stereotyping among men versus women. And I would encourage you to go to her site. I'll go back to it if you're interested, for those of you on the fine art side. And the reason is because all the things that I've been talking about, she does just as well, but it's on the fine art side. She's bringing it from her own experience autobiographically. She's using the milieu that I was talking about. The Indian film poster is one great contemporary milieu. There's a bunch of other stuff I'll show you that uses the contemporary milieu. And so she comes at a lot of the same issues that I do as an idea, but it's all autobiographical. It's all fine art rather than documentary derived. So that's the Bollywood posters. And then she just did some brand new ones while we were in India earlier this year on the Delhi rape. And she does have some documentary derived stuff. It's made with a Holga camera. You all know what a Holga camera, plastic lens, toy camera. This is her series called Memories of India, and it's about that she has this memory of India from her childhood, which obviously is not always the same as the India of today. So they're black and white. The Holga has the vignetting, one point in focus, the edges kind of fall apart in a very memory-like way. And then she did a project on the Backlash against everybody who's not white in the wake of 9/11. And so if you read the text on this one, it'll explain the rest. I'm not going to go through all of them in great detail, but it was about the stereotyping in the immediate wake of 9/11. And this was born of her own experience of being seen as an outsider. And she ended up photographing only eyes because most of the people she was interviewing didn't want to be shown. We're using fingerprints. Next project is called An Indian from India. When people meet her, they ask her where she's from. She says, I'm from Rhode Island. They say, no, where are you really from? So it's about the confusion between Native Americans. This is an actual historical photograph by Edward Curtis, and then this is something that she's done through Photoshop. And I mentioned this one because this idea of the milieu. In the fine art world, there's a big bunch of questions in the fine art world milieu are around identity, existing imagery, stereotyping, all of those themes she weaves into this work. And I'm not saying the work is the best that's out there, but I'm saying that she solved some of the same problems in terms of raising issues, finding people who would be interested with it, using the visual language, etc., to make this work. Again, the left photo is the factually historical one. The right photo, she's used the Photoshop to take the background out and then pose like this. This is my daughter, who's now 20. Traditional American Indian mother and child, contemporary Indian American mother and stepchild. And in the fine art world, one of the things you really need to be cognizant of, I'm going to do this gesture a lot in the next hour or so. In the fine art world, you need to be aware of I'm sorry, in the documentary world, you can usually root whatever your project is in political events, the sort of the milieu that I was talking about, issues that people are interested in relatively documentary-derived factual news, historical context. In the fine art world, obviously, you usually can't do that, so you have to do things like reference existing work, reference other themes people have used before, or riff on actual existing imagery, riff on how film talks about a given subject, or poetry, or something like that. And so if you're thinking your project's more on that side, you have to understand you're not actually going to work in a vacuum. You're going to be working in a larger milieu. It won't be a documentary event-based one, but it still will be a larger cultural context. The one on the left is important because this is actually the caption, Tom Torlino Navajo on entry to the Carlisle School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. This is Anu, of course, being sarcastic, but in the original imagery, this is in fact a historical photograph, Tom Torlino 3 years later. And so she's riffing on it by making herself go from that to that. And then the last work, which we were just in India for 7 months on, she had a Fulbright fellowship. It was very kind of you. You sent me twice now, and you sent her once. So your tax dollars are going to somebody, I guarantee you that. On a project called Regenerations. This is actually an animation. It should be playing, yeah. And it's about 3 generations of Indian women and how you can see the change in culture and dress and body language and comfort among the multiple generations of women in India. And they're actually exhibited as photographs, so when you walk up to them, you think they're photographs, but then they start going through this animation, and so it's a photograph that comes alive. This is from India. This is from Vietnam. We got to go to Vietnam a couple of years ago on her university's money. It was very kind of them. It always starts with an existing historical photograph, and then this is the woman who was a young girl then and now obviously is much older, so it goes through the family over time. And again, I'm not saying you should think about using this technology. I think you need to understand there are a lot of ways of solving a problem visually. And if you can do all the other things of fitting it within the cultural context, maybe using existing imagery, the snapshot, the family snapshot, we all know that. That's a really common sort of starting point. So that's something that she's used, I think, successfully. And then the current work that she just finished doing was on families who were affected by the partition of India in 1947. And so this is one family that we will also go through. So it was great-grandmother, grandmother, daughter, and I thought we go to granddaughter. Yeah. And so the 2 parts, the art of this, is, of course, finding the historical photograph, posing the current generations so they look like the old photograph lighting-wise and stuff like that, and then doing an interview to get that one quote that really sort of tells the whole story. All right. So I did all that because I want those of you who said, it seemed like when we did the vote on personal documentary, fine art versus documentary, at least half or more were on the fine art side. So when we come to questions at the end, if you have a question, I will do my very best to answer them. I will tell you that I'm going to be sort of channeling my wife because of her expertise over there. But because we swap project proposals and we are our first editors and stuff like that, I'm pretty well versed in her stuff and she's pretty well versed in mine. All right. So I'm going to take you now through the evolution of my project. And a couple things to pay attention to. Again, try not to think about it as a documentary, but think about responding to the milieu. How did I get it out there? Because that becomes the next big question. How do you get the visibility? Because the visibility is really, really important. How do you get feedback? Just because you love your pictures doesn't mean anything. How many of your moms love your pictures? All right? All right. You need somebody else to look at your pictures and give you some kind of feedback. So there's a whole series of things that I'm going to talk about in terms of what I did for this project to get to the point where I am right now. And this all started in 2009 when the seed of the idea came from a photo agency that I work with. And they wrote this long email about the economic situation. And again, I'm not going to make you read all these, but what I found so interesting is I can actually go back, unlike any other project, and trace it to the very, very birth. Okay? And in that thing, they talked about the Farm Security Administration, which many of you know was a program of the US government under the Works Progress Administration, where they sent out photographers all over the country to photograph what life was like during the Depression. And so they actually referenced it to the FSA. And those of us who were involved, we actually called it the new FSA. Ironically, the project didn't take off because most people didn't follow through, but I was one of the ones who did. Talking more about the FSA. Then for a while they called it the Poverty Book Project, if you see at the top. And then they actually they gave me an intro letter, which I could use to pitch to people because I was doing a more documentary-derived thing. In terms of you on the fine art side, at some point in time, you're going to have to establish credibility. In my case, I was lucky because I had an agency behind me. And as I said before, where I actually started was with these guys, because an article in the New York Times about these guys who clean out the houses. And that's what started me on this. What's it like to go through other people's discards? And I did that, didn't work out. This is a pitch letter that I sent to strangers and friends. And you're going to have to develop a pitch letter. If your project is completely self-portraits where you're only photographing yourself, you're fine. How many people's projects are going to somehow involve other people, other places? Okay, so you're going to have to develop some kind of pitch letter. So this was my pitch letter. It's changed tremendously. I mean, I could probably do a whole hour on just how your pitch letter changes. So I started writing friends to seek access. I was writing friends of friends to seek access, because in this case I was going to Arizona, so I wanted to photograph some houses there. I started writing strangers. I'm writing everybody. And at this point in time, all I know is I want to get into houses at that window, but I don't really know much yet. I'm writing friends of our realtor, because in the middle of this process, we sold our old house and bought a new house. So this woman named Jane was able to give me some connections. I was writing friends of our realtors, where I ended up contacting a community group. All right? And try again. I know I'm repeating myself. It's not about the documentary project. It's about who can help you find whatever it is that you want to get access to. Friends of friends agreeing to help me in the future. One of the strangers that I wrote, the guy who got me into the house with the trophies, actually, agreeing to help. This is the guy with the red telephone agreeing to help. This is the guy with the Connecticut flag agreeing to help. And then I saw this. A brand new website, which it started back in 2009, called socialdocumentary.net, which is now pretty well established. But I saw they had a photo competition on the global recession. All right? This is the part about you need to be thinking, how far can you stretch your stuff? I just applied for something and the theme was grace. And if you go far enough into the definition of grace, there's one of the definitions of grace is sort of the moment of pause when everything kind of flows and ebbs out. And I actually wrote in my proposal, the reason that my work is about grace is it's because that moment of things flowing out. I don't know if it'll work, but I learned from this that that trick of sort of teasing your project out, whatever it's about, is really, really important. So I submitted for socialdocumentary.net. This is my web page. And lo and behold, I got a People's Choice Award. All right? I got a whopping $75, but it doesn't matter. What I got is I got a People's Choice Award. All right? The first thing after you start the project, there's a lot of things. One of the things after you start any project is you're going to start disseminating and sharing it with other people, right? You need what's called third-party validation. All right? Some strangers gave me the People's Choice Award for this project. And so then it was picked up by somebody at ICP, and they put it on the ICP website because of the socialdocumentary.net award. And then I have a educational website that I'll talk about at the end called the Wells Point. How many people have seen that? Okay, you're all going to go to it afterwards, I know. And I have a monthly newsletter, so I'm always out there prospecting among my subscribers to the newsletter. to find how to get access. Here I am making an appointment with a California contractor, the guy that you saw with the red phone. And then I'm delivering images to my agency. And I mention this because not everybody works with a stock agency, but one of the questions is, how are you paying for this? I'm doing assignments. I do get to sell some of it as stock, but I'm always thinking, where are all the different ways I can get the stuff out there? I'm seeking input from other people on my project proposal. So I sent it out to some friends, and they wrote me back. Going back to one of the cleanup contractors again. My friend suggested another contractor who eventually sent me to a famous LA realtor known for dealing with foreclosures, and this guy was in the New Yorker at the peak of the foreclosure crisis. And he's the guy who got me into the house with the sandwich. And there's a big yes from him, and a text message from his operations manager about that very house. And then I built a web page of the work on my own site to refer people to, both the realtors and also people who are going to potentially exhibit it and the work. And I'm now doing this at this point because I'm into the project for about a year. I've sent it out to a bunch of people. I've got a bunch of feedback, which I'll talk about more. I'm starting to find what work. I've got a couple of little awards and stuff like that. Don't put your stuff up too early, all right? You really only get one chance to make a first impression. So wait a while before you put the stuff up. And then I got a query from Photo District News. They were doing an article on foreclosure photography, all because of the socialdocumentary.net thing. And then there was a mention in the Photo District News on Facebook. And then, unfortunately, this is something that I just thrown in because it's absolute truth. One of the cleanup contractors was unhappy with the images on one of my agency's site. So we removed them because my agent said it wasn't worth the trouble. This is sort of one of those real world things. A note from the agency about how we're not going to fight this guy. I try to have all my interactions via email, both for clarity and to keep a paper trail and also to control the dialogue, all right? I have yet to have that one thing with the guy saying, I don't like the pictures, take them off the website, and it wasn't worth the fight, even though I was right, it wasn't worth the fight. That's the only thing that's gone wrong in doing this in 4 years. It's really quite amazing. I keep knocking on wood. But part of it's because I have a perfect paper trail throughout, all right? Strongly encourage you to do as much as you can in writing. Out of the blue, an NGO writes me about a potential collaboration. The NGO writes me about having a collaboration because they saw one of my images was in the New York Times Opinionator and the Lens blog because of the socialdocumentary.net thing. And then we go through this very extensive dialogue. We're going to submit a grant proposal. The organization's called the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. And I put that up there because, again, it's not the foreclosure organization, and more importantly, they don't care about photography at all. They have a political mission, all right? So the subject matter, I can't emphasize this enough. The subject matter, that whatever you're doing, whether it's artistic or documentary, the subject matter drives it. We applied for something called the Audience Engagement Grant. If you're doing something that's documentary derived, you want to put this on your list. The Audience Engagement Grant is from the Open Society Institute, where photographers take an existing body of work and devised an innovative and effective way to use the work as a tool for social change. And it's actually funded by the Open Society Institute here in New York. And the way they work is the way that a lot of foundations work increasingly, is you submit a very small proposal, a couple, 3 pages, and then if you make it to the next round, then you get to submit the big one. Audience Engagement Grant. The idea was that they were supposed to help me access foreclosures to photograph via their nationwide network of local member groups. So I'm potentially going to get a grant. They did, in fact, end up doing an exhibition, and I had hoped they would get me more houses as well. Do y'all know the word ancillary benefits? You should all know the word ancillary benefits. I make my living finding ancillary benefits. Okay, so I'm going to Arizona. Can I do a workshop? Can I shoot some houses? Can I find some new students? Can I? I've been self-employed for, oh Lord, almost 30 years. So you have to start thinking like that. We made it to the final round of the Audience Engagement Grant, but we didn't win, unfortunately. So that was part of the process of how I started to get the visibility out there. I'm going to talk about that a little more, but I also want to touch on one thing that for my project is very important. I keep a detailed record of who helps me access the houses, and then I send all of them who in that line of connections from the intro to the access, photographs, either fine art prints, or the newest things that a lot of the realtors want is they want me to go photograph this good house after I photograph this bad house. And I'm happy to do that because most of them don't make very good photographs. And so it's an easy way for me to solve their problem. And I have my contact list sorted by states. Yes, I am completely compulsive. But if you want this project to end up having a life of its own, to keep going, to keep getting out there, you can't piss people off. You need to know who's seen it before. You need to know who's helping you. So my contact list sorted by state. And so now we're going to talk about getting it out there. These are images on the websites of different photo agencies. This is a Getty site. Bless you. And then here you'll see this is the image on the Getty site. And this is how it was used on the Forbes website. And I make my living as a publication photographer. And I'm not saying you should or shouldn't do that. But there's a huge market out there for imagery. And then the other thing is if you do it successfully, a lot of times, how many of you read the Sunday New York Times Magazine? You should be reading the New York Times magazine every single week because they toggle back and forth. Like this last week was the breast cancer issue. And if you saw the cover, the breast cancer cover tells you right away that this is a story that they can't illustrate through a documentary-derived approach. And they had those stupid cliches of people on marches, which I thought was not a very good way. But they're an example of a publication that's regularly struggling with certain stories that can't be illustrated documentary-derived and certain stories that can be. And you should be thinking, if your story is fine art, but it's about some important theme that somebody's going to be coming to, you, in fact, may be able to get the work out there if you follow all of the promotional things that I've been talking about, even if your story is not documentary-derived. I got very lucky on this, or maybe I timed it well, but because the foreclosure crisis unfortunately continued after 2009, this was the fastest project I've ever done from shoot to stock resale. I had a portfolio of the work on the ABC Network website through a different photo agency. And I'm showing you this because you're probably looking at those and saying, those aren't the best ones, though the rabbit is nice. Very sort of straight-on representational photograph of a bunch of foreclosures in California. A different one from Florida. And what I'm stopping at is I learned to utilize the editing choice of the various publications and sites to adjust how I shoot and how I subsequently edit the work. It's really, really important. If you're doing documentary-derived work, by definition, you expect it to be out there so you know out loud, up front, that people who are going to look at it better get it. All right? If you're doing fine art stuff, you still actually need to think of that exact same thing. Are people who are going to look at the work, maybe in the New York Times Magazine, maybe on the web, are they going to get it without you being there to explain it? So what I've actually done is that I have a stack of about 100, 150 prints, and I take them around to my friends, and they literally edit them for me. And I'm continually taking out ones that are not successful in the eyes of my editing audience and putting in new ones. And so this is a friend of mine, Olivia in Providence, and she's going through the stack, and she's going to weed them down. Because I'm perfectly comfortable, having spent my entire life as a publication photographer, balancing my work between the external and the internal. And those of you on the fine art side, you need to keep that in mind. If it's too bizarre, it may work for you, but it doesn't work for them. And if you want to get it out there, it's that balancing act between what's perfect for you and unreadable for them, and so obvious to them that you no longer care about it. And so what I had everybody do is they pick their favorites out, and then she goes and she puts her initials on the back, and you can see some of the photos are big hits, and some of them nobody votes for. And after 10 or 15 people, certain ones go out and new ones come in. And the newest thing that I've done, which has just started happening, is that I do what I now call instant editing. I'm really obsessed about the idea of feedback because I don't think that any of us are such good photographers we can do it all on our own. So what I do is I share the top images from one day's shoot with about 10 of my peers at the end of the day's shoot in order to get some input on how to improve when photographing the next day. It's helped me hone in on which are the best images from each day and to add them to the collective body of work. And so what that means is that this is some stuff. I was in Florida in March, and I would send by email PDFs to the same list of 10 people. And I got feedback while I was on location rather than waiting until later. And then this is my list of the people who are going to do what I call the instant editing set. There's a woman named Abigail in California, Dan's in New York, Michael's in California. And then I aggregate their feedback to see which work best from the most of my instant edits. I'm crowdsourcing my editing, okay? And it's really, really important you understand that, documentary or not, all right? Yes, it's your work. It's meaningful and important to you, but you also need to understand that people out there need to get it. So what I've got here is blue is 100% in, yellow is ones where there were two different versions of the same image were successful, so I have to decide between those two. And then this is an example of the written feedback. A friend of mine wrote me this, it was very funny. What were you thinking? Or there is such a thing as wasting film at your age. And I'm not saying you're going to get that, but I'm a big believer in getting feedback of my work along the way. All right. So I started out doing publication work first, newspapers, then magazines, as a job and a mission, so I could earn a living and spur social change. That market's disappeared, but new markets have arisen. This is my most successful project to date using these new multiple media channels. The good news is there's no more writer-driven stories, which is what I used to do for a long time. I completely control the narrative. The bad news is more responsibility falls on my part. And this is all true for most of you. Maybe not the first part about photojournalism, but increasingly you are controlling the entire narrative. That can be to your advantage or your disadvantage. And for my case, it's a logical outgrowth of my experience freelancing for the Philadelphia Inquirer Sunday magazine, where I found the stories, I created the narratives, and then the writers wrote to my finished pieces. That was back in the good old days. All right? So these are the exhibitions, and I will go over these, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about getting it out there. So I had an exhibition in Virginia through the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, ArtSpace in North Carolina because of the New York Times, Rutgers because of the ArtSpace show, and Yellow Peril because they're in Rhode Island, and I wrote them cold. Portfolios of the work were published to the ABC website, Photo Techniques magazine, and Witness, the journal of the Black Mountain Institute. Those were all paying, by the way. Okay, I'm not talking about the free portfolio publications, which are very useful things, by the way. Free portfolio publications are better than nothing, but these are the paying things, and this has enabled me to continue it. All right? How many of you, well, go home, I'll give you the Wells Point, sign up for the newsletter. One of the things you'll see is that I continue to update people on the activities that I'm doing, and I spent the last 2 weeks sending my work out to a bunch of different photo festivals all over the world. The new thing in photo festivals these days is not necessarily they'll have 5 or 10 exhibits, but they'll have a night of 30 or 40 short shows of people's work. And they get like 800 people submitting, and I just got selected one in Australia that had 800 applicants and 52 of us were picked. I mention that because to me, 800 people applied, only 52 are picked. It's one more way, and it's free, by the way, to apply. It's a great resume line. And they actually sent me an email saying, all right, between now and August when we do the show, here's all the promotional things we're going to do. Here's the promotional things we hope you're going to do, so we'll be symbiotically promoting it. The reason I like it is A, it's free. B, perfect strangers in Australia looked at the work and they got it. So you should be looking at photo festivals as well. Contests are also very good. The problem with contests, number one, is you got to pay. Number two, contests, you have to pay a lot of attention to who the juror is. Most of these photo festivals have a large jury of 5 or 10 people, so if you don't appeal to one person, you'll appeal to a different person. The competitions and the contests are almost always one juror, so unless your work aligns with his or her taste, you're not likely to succeed. The work was featured, as I said, in the New York Times Opinionator and the New York Times Lens blog. I've also had profiles in Lens Scratch, Art Memes, Small Camera, Big Picture blog. And it won prizes, small prize from Forward Thinking Museum and socialdocumentary.net. And each one of those are opportunities to promote it. And that goes back to sort of why do you do the personal project? A, I hope you do it because it's meaningful and important to you. But B, you do it to create visibility. How many people are doing photography for money in this room right now? How many think you're doing photography for money someday? How many of you will honestly admit out loud that the cameras have gotten so good that it's no longer about the skill of taking photographs? Really? As far as your end user is, it's exactly what's happened. In the day when I started out, what made me successful so long ago was I had a skill that nobody had. For better or for worse, the cameras can do so much, or your end users think your cameras can do so much, that that's not what differentiates you. What differentiates you is what do you bring to it? What do you care about? What's your passion? What's your personality? That's what this project does for me. I don't get hired to photograph inside foreclosed houses very often. I'm doing a job next week in Cape Cod. It's a portrait. But the editor looked at this, and so this is a person I can relate to. This is a person I can connect to. You need to understand that your project may or may not get you paying work. That isn't the primary goal of your project. Your project is to create visibility, to make you different than the next guy, so your end user, whether they're an art buyer, a publication, a museum, a magazine, any of those, so they can understand who you are. Because for better or for worse, the playing field has been largely leveled by the technology, so what can you bring that the other guy can't? That's what this project has been so helpful for me, is it's brought all these other things in terms of my visibility. All right, so now I'm just going to go through all the time that I spend what my day job is. My day job is promoting this thing. And here, for example, this is my desktop promoting the work, lining up new shoots and applying for grants. Wherever you see green is some active thing that I've got out there, either a competition. Ballarat, second from the top in this column right here. Ballarat's the one from Australia that I just heard about yesterday. Delhi Photo Festival is another free one that I applied for. Angkor Wat in Cambodia, they have a photo festival that I also just applied for. This was also a free one. Active dissemination is green. Finished is blue. I know, I'm compulsive. All right. These are all the old publications that I've sent my stuff out to. These are the old workshops that I've applied to or taught, built around other projects or this project. And then these are old or current. These are old exhibitions on this or previous projects. And old competitions as well. And so here's just the last few. This is the New York Times Opinionator piece. That was the photo there that you saw before. This is a profile in art meme. Profile in lens scratch and witness. The witness blog is the one that paid. This one was free. I've started writing articles. This is a portfolio of mine which was published with an article that I wrote about personal projects. This was a profile on small camera, big picture. And this is a recent interview exhibition in the Providence, Phoenix, because I'm having an exhibition right now at a gallery called Yellow Peril. And this is the rest of the review. And any such event, or the small award, or anything else, I use to promote on social media, both about me and the project. So this is when I won something from the Forward Thinking Museum. This is when the Yellow Peril Media started promoting the current show. This is a friend of mine promoting the current show. This is the opening of the current show, and this is a time-lapse video that I actually made of the opening. And then this is something that just came out last month. This is a really nice quote from a magazine called Rhode Island Monthly. I'm showing it to you because A, I like to brag, but B, half of my project proposal, half of my pitch is written based on what other people who have seen the work have said about it. That's the lesson that you want to take away. Whenever you show your work to somebody, it's nice when they say, I like it. That doesn't do you any good. When they talk about the resonance with childhood or how it feels emotionally dislocated, now you're getting somewhere. That's something you can use, you can write down, you can have somebody else, when they see your project proposal, they can get your work. Because the fundamental problem with any kind of personal project is you're not there to explain it. You're so, and I'm as bad as anybody, you're so immersed in making that project that you believe in it, and you know they should believe in it, but when they see it, you're not sitting next to them. So you have to be brutal about getting somebody else to look at it, take that step back and say, yeah, this is working, this is not working. And so when I get a nice quote like that, let's go into my project proposal. And I think if I did this right, The next thing, yeah, there you go. The last thing I'm going to do, and then I'm going to stop and take questions, is a multimedia piece. Because increasingly, you're putting your work out there on the web, right? And so how are you going to put your work out there on the web so they don't expect you to be sitting there? Because that sitting there problem is always a problem you have to get around. So this is the latest form of how I've been putting the work out there.
My house, my home, is sacred, and it is for most people too. A stranger can't just walk in. It's not allowed. People can't take it, or touch your things, or rearrange your life, or dump you outside on the sidewalk like a piece of trash.
I like going home. I like walking in that familiar door, and I like hearing those familiar sounds and knowing exactly which closet door is going to creak and the familiar chiming of a clock. You know, I like visiting the ghosts of my past. It's very comforting. I like having that there. I know what those people were giving up because, see, I still have it. And so I looked at it and I was like, oh, they don't have that anymore.
A person always misses their childhood home. It's a place of great memories. It's part of their identity.
And I just really like a place that feels like a respite from the rest of the world.
I do worry about my parents, my father's family home. It's been in my family for, I'm the 9th generation to live there. I worry about losing that from my family.
When I was a teenager, I lived in a house, and it was a fabulous house because it had all sorts of nooks and crannies, and it was old. And we left that home because we got poorer and poorer, and we kept moving into smaller and smaller houses. My parents were divorced.
I worked all my life to build up fabulous credit, and now I can't even look at the numbers, so they must be in the minuses.
What people who left clutter behind them like that were doing was saying, screw you to the bank. Clean up my mess. You know, you wouldn't let me clean it up, so I'm going to let you clean it up.
Looking at the foreclosure photos, the heartbreaking part of it was as if these homes were torn open, and these people's lives were torn open, and you could see straight into things that you shouldn't be allowed to see.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I was supposed to have... Two more things I wanted to do. One is, I'm missing a slide. thewellspoint.com. It's as simple as that, thewellspoint.com. It is my educational website, and it's supposed to be the last slide, and something went wrong. And I would send you there for a couple reasons. One is hopefully you'll subscribe to the newsletter. Two, I blog every week, and I'm always talking about a lot of the issues I've raised. Three, a lot of the smaller parts of this are small podcasts and stuff on that site. And I know you're probably all just about to hear with information, so the idea is that if there's something that you didn't quite get, first go back there, and then second, drop me an email. And the second thing I want to do, and it's not because Olympus sponsors me, somebody asked me before, what cameras did I use? I started back in the Stone Age, as you saw, with Olympus film cameras, before some of you were probably born. Can we get the lights all the way up? And then I did get a grant from Nikon, and I used some other brand for a long time. And then in 1996, I started using Contax rangefinders, which are like Leicas, but they're autofocus, and I need something because my eyes aren't what they used to be. So from 96 until 2003, I used the Contax rangefinders, and the business went digital, and so I was forced to go digital. I would actually happily be using my Contaxes and shooting color slides, but the trade hasn't. So I'm sitting there with these Contax rangefinders, which they're not digital. So I did not have what most of you have what are called legacy lenses, where you had Canons or Nikons before. I did not. So I looked around, and at the time, the Olympuses were the only ones with a self-cleaning chip, which for dust and travel and all the stuff I do in the third world was really, really important. So I started using Olympuses. And then a couple years ago, I started working with Olympus, but I use Olympus because it solves my problem. Okay? When any photographer says, buy a Canon 5D, ask them him or her the following question. What problem does the camera solve? My problems. Number one problem, especially in New York City these days, I want to look like I don't know what I'm doing. Sad but true, right? That's problem number one. Problem number two, I can fit all this stuff in my low-pro bag over there and travel quite comfortably. Problem number three, 95% of what I shoot is done with that folding screen just like this. The foreclosure stuff, just about everything is done just like that, because I can engage with you in terms of eye contact, and I can do street photography and blast away because you're looking at me. Thank you very much. It's also been fabulous for doing the interiors, because you can get the camera in some weird position that you can't get with a regular SLR, because you have to put your eye up to the here, which it does, by the way. I can look through here as well, but that's not my primary use. My primary use is here. If you'll notice, if I'm trying to work in low light, I push hard on the strap because I can gain a couple of shutter speeds because there's no mirror here as well. So this camera solves a series of problems that I have as a photographer. And so that's the reason that I use the Olympuses. And they've been great in terms of the self-cleaning chips. Now they have a whole bunch of prime lenses, which is what I primarily use because I'm doing more and more video. And with the video, with the large maximum aperture lens, you can get more shallow depth of field. The other thing that I use a ton of, there we go, is my little tabletop tripod here. And it's really as simple as I'm inside some building. And sure, I could be hauling around a big tripod, but to be honest, who wants to? But I can do all my work just like this, especially with my folding screen, push really hard and blast away. And if I'm going to some house in some iffy neighborhood, all of it fits in there rather than the big thing. So for me, they've been really, really great cameras. They work really well in the third world where I work a lot. They're really good with New York City policemen because they don't think you know what you're doing. So that's why I use Olympuses.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.